Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew, who is here with me in studio ahead of attending the speech from the throne tomorrow. Premier, it's good to see you in person. Thanks for being here, sir.
Thanks for having me.
It's going to be a significant day, a brand new parliament with a new agenda and a speech delivered by the King. First time Canada's monarch has been here for this type of an event since 1977. What are your thoughts on what you're going to witness tomorrow?
Well, it's historic. It's a very significant moment. I think Canadian pride is at an all-time high. We've just come through a period of reckoning our relationship with the United States of America, and we've rallied around the flag. So to have the head of state here to deliver the throne speech for a new government, where Canadians have been engaged at the highest level since recent memory is great. But on a more lighthearted note, you know, the clip you showed of the speaker being dragged to the throne, the reason why that happened is because in British Parliament, time was the speaker would have to say some things that the King didn't like, and the King was not as, let's say, merciful back then with the speaker. And so being dragged into the speaker's chair often was the last appointment that British speakers ever got. So hopefully the King is going to treat our speaker in a much more generous, magnanimous fashion.
I think 6 or 7 speakers were actually beheaded at different stages.
I was trying to
because
around the issue.
I don't think Francis Scarpaleggia is facing that from King Charles, but you know, Henry VIII was enthusiastic about it, though, and sometimes after they were done on the job. But look, that's the history of it. The throne speech tomorrow is about the immediate future for the country and the agenda that the Prime Minister is promising to deliver on. What do you want to see as a fellow First Minister in the speech tomorrow as King Charles lays out essentially Mark Carney's agenda?
Well, I think there's 2 things. I think tone-wise, partnership, collaboration. I think for the past 6 months, premiers have really helped to lead Team Canada. And now that there's clarity coming out of the election and Mark Carney has a mandate, I'd like to have that partnership, that working together to advance Team Canada continue. Then when we move over to policy, I think the economic issues have to be the priority. At the same time, we're dealing with a conversation nationally coming out of the election. And what I would say is, if we sit around talking about politics, it's going to be like the family dinner table. We're always going to be arguing. But if we get down to work and we choose some economic projects to build the country, that's how we bring people together. So for us in Manitoba, we want to help our Western Canadian neighbors get their resources to Tidewater. We've got a port in northern Manitoba. So let's work together around ideas like that, so that we can put shovels in the ground and build the country up rather than looking in the rearview mirror.
You talk about partnership. Obviously, I don't sit at the First Minister's table, but from the outside looking in, when people like you come out and speak to people like me, there does seem to be a unity of purpose at this First Minister's table with Prime Minister Carney. How would you actually describe the dynamic there?
Yeah, no, I think the premiers understand what it's like to be a premier. And so there's a certain amount of understanding for our peers around the table, whether you're a New Democrat, a progressive conservative, a liberal, or even one of the territorial nonpartisan premiers. So looking ahead to next week when we get together with the Prime Minister for our formal First Ministers meeting, I think you're going to see a unity of purpose. I know we just came out of a meeting with the Western premiers last week, so BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, the territories, and us. And we're going to be at the table with a very clear ask. Here's how we can build a corridor across Western Canada that's really going to power the Canadian economy. So there is that unity of purpose, and I think what I'm hearing from this government so far is an openness to collaborate, the willingness to cooperate. And so if we can build that up, I think Canada's going to be able to take advantage of the window of opportunity that's open right now.
I know you've talked about building the transmission line to Nunavut and opening up the port of Churchill, these sorts of things.
Yeah.
But I wonder, when you talk about this corridor and policy on an economic partnership, what is it you're hoping to see? Because we've heard a lot of, and I don't want to dismiss the rhetoric, but it's been rhetorical promises to move on things. We haven't seen actual decisions on the big projects and the big spenders yet.
Yeah, so we've been working really hard in Manitoba, getting the First Nations and Indigenous nations on side, because I think a lot of money has been sitting on the sidelines for resource projects in Canada because of a lack of clarity about what the duty to consult means, about what does true engagement with Indigenous nations mean. So I think part of our value proposition when we show up at the Premier's table, when we show up with the federal government as Manitoba, is to say we think we have a model where we can get things done, we can get the shovels in the ground more quickly. And then, of course, I think there's a lot of opportunity. Western Canada is a driver for a huge part of our Canadian economy, But if we build something in the West and we use steel from other parts of the country, we use icebreakers from Ontario or Nova Scotia or Quebec, I think there's a lot of ways we can, that maybe we're powering the, feeding the refineries in New Brunswick. I think there's a lot of ways we can make this into a truly nation-building project.
But do you expect, if not final decisions, directional signals by the meeting next week in Saskatoon? Because on what sort of thing, like the Western Corridor, what's, because there are these projects of national interest they've asked you for. Do you think we're going to get real clarity on those a week from now?
I think we will. And what I would say is that the Western Corridor that includes hitting northern tidewater in Manitoba is a nation-building project, but it's also a national unity project. If we can send a message to Alberta, to Saskatchewan, that we're serious about building up the economy and ensuring that they can expand their provincial economies at the same pace that the rest of the country can, I think that's how we bring people together.
Is it a pipeline to that port? Is that what you're
I think a pipe is probably a part of it. For us as Manitobans with clean hydroelectricity, exporting hydropower to Saskatchewan and Alberta is a huge opportunity for us. But if there's a pipe there, you know, we'd be open to hearing the pitches from the private sector. What good makes sense? Is it an energy product? Is it something novel like maybe hydrogen or even a potash slurry? Let's have that conversation. I think the message is we're open for business. There's a window of opportunity right now. How can we work together to build up Canada?
So on that, you know, to get that Western Economic Corridor going, what would you like to hear specifically on that in the speech tomorrow, and certainly from the Prime Minister directly a week from now?
I think all of the directional signals, to use the term that you've shared here, hitting northern tidewater at Hudson Bay, name-checking Churchill, name-checking northern Manitoba is a good signal. Sending a message that the Arctic is a part of that, whether it's a specific mention of Gray's Bay or more broadly just that the territories are a part of this thing, sending a message that the energy in Western Canada is valued. I think those are what I'll certainly be watching for, and I think what many of the Western premiers will be watching for too.
David Eby, though, the Premier of British Columbia, had suggested there's so much opportunity for Western Canada, and that's where the economic future is for this country over the next number of years and decades, that the talk of separation, it unsettles it. Already it's maybe creating uncertainty for capital. What are your views on that?
Well, I want not just a nation-building project, but a national unity project. And if we say we can build something to make sure that every Canadian, including every Albertan, is going to have a more prosperous future for the next 40 years, 50 years, I think that's how we do it.
What do you think the Prime Minister needs to do about the Alberta issue? You know, he was born in the Northwest Territories, but grew up in Edmonton, as he reminds us, and right now he's facing a challenge there that a Prime Minister has to deal with directly.
Well, he can start with something that I will never do, which is wear an Edmonton Oilers jersey.
Well, last time we spoke, you had a Jets jersey on. It didn't go too well.
I'm still singing my healing song at home about that. But, you know, I think there's that maybe more like soft power kind of friendly stance towards Alberta. But realistically, Alberta has an energy economy and they're looking to find tidewater. So let's work together and send a message that there's a place for that in Canada. And we can do it the right way. We can do that with respect for the environment. We can do that with respect for our national economic interests. And we can do that that's inclusive with Indigenous nations as well, too.
Soft power won't be enough, though, right? Like, don't you think there needs to be
comes down to money, right?
Yeah, well, it needs a proof point, right?
Yeah.
Something's got to change for that to change.
And so I think the money would come in two ways. One is the economic opportunity for Western Canada. We're building jobs. We're making investments. But two, it's, you know, the federal government has a larger purse in most of the provinces. And if they make an investment that signals seriousness to Western Canada, I think that'll go a long way too.
On the project that you've talked about each time you've been on the last little while about the transmission line and opening up the port in Churchill.
Yeah.
What kind of dollar amounts are we talking about here? Because there's a lot of big projects coming up and none of them are cheap, Premier, as I'm sure you know.
And that's kind of the point, though.
Yeah, I get it.
So we've been investing maybe $30 million a year alongside the federal government with the Churchill project. But I think this next phase, you're talking like $30 billion. 50 billion. That's a lot of boots. That's a lot of hard hats. That's a lot of people working. And the real question is, how do we get the private dollars that are sitting on the sideline right now into the game to bankroll something like that? I think part of it is regulatory certainty, which of course will want regulatory equity in response to that, but also a signal from the federal government that they're going to green light, that they're going to invest, and that they're going to make sure that the environment is such that the private sector can succeed.
So if you get everything you want, as a final point, on the signals and the alignment, because right now you take people at their word until you're proven wrong.
Sure.
That's where they want to go with it. Does Canada have the workers to do all of these things? If Doug Ford gets what he wants, Daniel Smith, Scott Moe, Wab Kinew, there is not a surplus of skilled tradesmen sitting around this country ready to go.
But that's how you send a message. You bid up the price of labor, wages go up, kids in high school decide that they want to pursue a red seal and go to work building these big projects. And if we're talking about getting everything we want, well, Stanley Cup for the Winnipeg Jets too. I'll put that at top of my list.
Well, he might get you an Oilers Cup this year, but there's no way it's going to be the Jets. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew, appreciate your dire Jets enthusiasm. Appreciate your time. Thank you, sir.
Thanks so much.
Philippe Lagassé is Associate Professor of International Affairs at Carleton University and one of our experts on the Westminster traditions. Good to see you again, sir. You too. What do you make of this moment? The King traveling is a short 24-hour trip to give what they say will be about a 30-minute speech. What do you make of him coming here to deliver this speech at this moment?
I think, as you said, it's kind of a pivotal piece.
Just one sec. I don't think we got your mic. Just try it now.
Am I back?
There we go.
All
we
right.
got you. All right. Thank you.
Sorry about
Let's
that.
go.
So, as you said, I think it's a kind of a pivotal moment given the nature of the U.S. rhetoric towards Canada over the past few months. Mm-hmm. And if you want to demonstrate the importance of Canadian sovereignty, why not bring in the sovereign to do so? So I think that's really the message more than anything else. He is the legal personality of the Canadian state. He's the highest office holder of the Canadian state. And if you're trying to make a message around our institutions, our endurance as a nation, our endurance as a state, having him come in and open the Parliament is a good way to do that.
So the monarch is the message in some ways, just his presence and this moment rather than any specific words he says, you think?
Well, the words are going to be largely written by the government. The palace may have a few lines in there that is meant to express his affection for Canada and his admiration for the country, but it is largely the government's message. I think we need to be clear about that. Now, what's in there and how pointed it is will be very interesting to watch, but I think there is also the element of it will be broadcast, the King saying words in defense of Canadian sovereignty and of the government's intention to move forward on a fairly robust agenda to defend that sovereignty. So that also is going to be notable.
How far do you think the speech can go on that front? Because, look, there's a back and forth between the Prime Minister's people who write the speech and the palace who want to protect the monarch. And then, the King can't act without the advice of the Prime Minister. But in this case, well, he's the King of Canada, he's also the King of England. There are two Prime Ministers there, and Keir Starmer has a different agenda than Mark Carney in a lot of respects when it comes to dealing with the United States.
Right, so I think what you're pointing to is one of the interesting tensions that we're living through here. As you say, we're in a personal union with the United Kingdom. Now, normally, advice from the Canadian Prime Minister to the King of Canada would simply go from the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council office to Buckingham Palace, right. And there'd be a back and forth between them about what's appropriate for the King to say and making sure that he doesn't say anything or we don't put controversial words in his mouth. But to your point, there's now a third kind of actor being brought into this, which is likely the Cabinet Office in the UK, saying, look, we also have our own diplomatic uses of the Crown here. It's been something that we've pushed and really emphasized in our relationship with the United States with the offer of a second state visit. So we'd like you to, back off a little bit on this. It'll be interesting to see just how much of that feedback or concern the Canadian government and the palace have taken on board. But it certainly is a demonstration of some of the tensions that can emerge when you share a monarch.
Yeah, how do you reconcile that? And is it ultimately the King's call? Because I know Mark Carney in the interview with Sky News said Canadians were kind of annoyed at the idea of a second state visit invitation, though, and I know the King made it, but that was Keir Starmer's idea, right? So how does that get reconciled? Does the King just make the call on how far he's willing to go, or how do you do it?
In some cases, when the prime ministers of two realms just can't agree, or the King is getting two sets of advice, the King may have to choose to say, I'm going to follow the advice of this particular Prime Minister. And the Queen had to do that in certain occasions, and she, in fact, leveraged the fact that she was getting advice from one of her other realms to do something she wanted to do, even if the British government wasn't particularly keen. So I suspect that in this case, in spite of the fact that there would have been a wealth of excuses for why the king couldn't come, his cancer treatments, whatever it is, I think the fact that he accepted Mr. Carney's advice demonstrates that he had a personal interest in coming here, and he wanted to do this, notwithstanding any trepidations his British Prime Minister might have had.
So what are you going to be watching for tomorrow? I mean, you, I would presume, will watch this speech through a very different lens than I will watch it, because I'll be looking, very specifically for things to ask the Prime Minister about and see where he's going with things. How will you be viewing this? What are you going to be watching for?
Really, what the government is going to include in the speech that would be over and above what we've already seen in the mandate letters, or the mandate letter, I should say. And similarly, just how far have they managed to go, or perhaps not go, in having the king provide a robust defense of Canadian sovereignty, or simply is it going to be much softer language around his affection for Canada? Right. So I think that'll be an interesting indication of how that relationship is being played between PMO, the Palace, PCO, and perhaps the Cabinet Office in the UK.
Well, and there's two segments to the speech, right? There's the meat of it, which is written by the Government of Canada, either through PCO, PMO, but then there's the opening, and that is the King's personal hand, or the Palace writes that, or the Governor General's when they deliver the throne speech. I guess there is where we should look to see where the King was willing to go on these particular issues. How do you view it?
My sense is that because the Palace is going to be providing that language, it's going to be very cautious and emphasizing his affection for Canada, perhaps, and the pride that he perhaps takes in being the King of Canada.
Calling it a sovereign nation, probably.
Right. Maybe, but I don't know if they're going to go that far. It'd be interesting to see if they do. But I suspect it's going to also marry well with what's in the words written by the Canadian government. If the Canadian government's portion of the speech is more pointed, then I suspect that the front end will be softer.
But what would be the risk in using the words sovereign nation? Because, there was this frustration when this all started. Where is the Commonwealth? Where is the King? Why aren't they, and there's a bunch of reasons about protocol and the way those organizations function as to why they weren't. But what would be the downside of the head of state expressing the sovereignty of the country?
I don't think there's necessarily a downside for Canada.
Right.
I think the issue is more, how does it play when it comes to the King's role as the King of the United Kingdom, and that government's efforts to really emphasize a special relationship with the United States and to use the King diplomatically in its dealings with the President. So in that respect, I don't think there's any issue with the King coming out and forcefully defending Canadian sovereignty. I think we would expect that. It's more, was there a tacit agreement between the governments of the United Kingdom and Canada to modulate that a little bit?
Just one last question. What's your sense, of how much Canadians are investing in this, right? Because, there's some public opinion polling out there. I think about 83% of people don't, it doesn't matter to them that the King is doing this versus the Governor General. And it's an institution that doesn't have the luster it had under Queen Elizabeth II, it seems. But what's your sense of what Canadians are looking for tomorrow, or is it just another day?
I think to your point, we have to be honest as people who work on these issues. As a Westminster guy, it kind of really interests me. And
not trying to talk it down either. Yeah.
And I see a lot of value in it, and I recognize, though, that I'm coming at it with a particular lens. Not everybody shares that lens. But to your point, I think most Canadians may find it interesting, a bit curious. I hope that because it's the King giving the speech, maybe they look into it a little bit, find out why he's the King of Canada, what's that all about. So could it serve an educational function? Could it draw more eyes to the speech than the speech would normally get amongst the voting public? I hope so. But let's be frank, the audience is not necessarily purely a Canadian one here. Yeah. We're also hoping that people in Washington watch the speech.
Yeah, and people take institutions for granted right up until the point they need them.
Exactly.
And this may be one of those moments in history. Philippe Lagassé, Associate Professor of International Affairs at Carleton University. Always appreciate the time, sir.
Thank you.